Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk briefly about the crucifixion, that is to say the crucifixion of Jesus, and its relation to salvation. Because I've seen on the internet lots and lots, all over the place, something, I'm not going to quote it, but just to, the Jack Chick version, because they tend to be variants of this, is roughly speaking that the point of the crucifixion was that God made some rule, and then, unfortunately, it was a dumb rule, and the Chick version is that, God can't allow sin in his presence, not because of his nature or the nature of sin or anything, just, arbitrary rule. And this sounded great, but turned out to be a dumb idea, because unfortunately man went and sinned, and so God's like, oh shoot, what the heck do I do? And then he came up with the idea of the crucifixion as a loophole to get around the rule that he himself had instituted. You can find Jack Chick saying this almost exactly. And I'm going to let this stand in for many, many variants about misunderstandings of the crucifixion. Now, I'm not going to explain the full significance of the crucifixion because, being only man, I can't. God's plans take into account the good of literally all of creation. All things visible and invisible. Many, many things that we do not, as human beings, even know about. Human beings can't comprehend all these things, let alone the good of all these things, and therefore we cannot understand in fullness any plan for the goodness of all things. We can understand some things, we can't understand everything. Anyone who is trying to sell you a comprehensive understanding of absolutely everything is selling something. A little bit like that line in The Princess Bride, movie I love. But there's that wonderful line where, I'm going to call him the Dread Pirate Roberts, says, life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something. And, yeah, the same sort of thing applies. Great line. If somebody is trying to tell you that they completely understand life, the universe, and everything, that they have everything you need to know, or as, heck, Jack Chick would say, all the answers, they're selling something. And it's not a comprehensive understanding of everything. So, I'm not trying to do that, because it's not possible. What I'm going to do is give just one explanation of one reason why the crucifixion was necessary. Because the general question is like, well, why couldn't God just say, like, I forgive everything? There are probably lots of reasons. I'm giving one. Okay. The one reason that I'm going to give is that people always focus on how sin is an offense against God. And it is. But, oh, I'm sorry. I forgot. I have to talk about justice first. It's kind of easy to forget if you spend too much time reading the classics, but the modern world has no understanding of justice. And so justice, as I'll be talking about it, the relevant sense of justice, has nothing to do with the criminal justice system, except insofar as the criminal justice system happens to conform to the ideal of justice. But justice is justice is balance, roughly speaking. The idea of karma in the modern West sort of fits. The basic, probably the simplest analogy is one of monetary transactions. So if I steal $10 from you, I owe you $10. We'll ignore opportunity costs and other stuff for the moment. They're real and important, but just for the sake of simplicity in this analogy, I owe you $10. Justice is restoring the $10 to you that I took. There's also some amount of, there also needs to be, there's a benefit gained, etc. On my part that I need to also restore because it was an illegitimate benefit. Again, ignore that just for simplicity. Because that basic concept of justice is giving what is owed suffices for the moment. The more complex thing just makes the crucifixion even more necessary, so we're going to ignore it. And justice can be satisfied, however, through a gift on the part of the party who's owed something. Because like any debt, if I lend you $10 and you're having trouble repaying, I can say, you know what? Don't worry, it's yours. What I'm actually doing when I say don't worry, it's yours, I'm not strictly speaking canceling with the debt. What I'm doing is giving you $10 that is then a satisfaction of, that $10 is then a satisfaction of the debt. So that you have, whatever state you have. And so your debt is therefore canceled. But it is, that canceling of the debt is not a going back in time and retroactively changing the past, because that can't happen. It is a gift in the present, though it is not, a physical gift. handed over. In the same way, in a circumstance of justice, if you steal $10 from me, you owe me $10, again simplifying, and I can give you the $10 such that that debt is then canceled. So in loose terms, I can waive away that debt, the debt of justice, in an injury against me. But I can't waive away the debt against justice in injury to someone else. So let's say you were to steal $10 from somebody else, man standing on the street. I can't say, oh, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal. What I can do, however, is take $10 out of my wallet and give it to the man and say, here, please forgive that guy. This is the $10 that he owes you. Please forgive him for it. And that man can then accept that in restitution of the debt owed, and then that debt is in fact satisfied there. So it is possible to do that. Now, I'm trying to think, what do I want to... Well, okay, really quickly, just as a small side note, that thing I mentioned earlier about the undue gain, the problem there is an undue, an unjust gain, unjust benefit, has to be counterbalanced by some sort of detriment. And so, in the case of pleasure, there's some sort of suffering that then balances out the pleasure within a just system. And so you can see that on the part of the crucifixion, that it also pays for the, in that suffering, there is therefore a restitution or balance of the unjust benefit gotten by sins that have been committed as well. So there is that, but that's sort of a side note to what I want to talk about. Useful concept to think about. But to get back to the nature of the debt, so going back to the example where I can give the man $10, but the thing is, it is possible for him to, say, no, I don't accept it. Although this brings up essentially a very interesting question. Is that a legitimate action? Is it okay if somebody is giving you $10 to say, no, I will not accept this payment that I am owed on behalf of the other guy, it has to come from him? Because at that point, you're not willing... Basically, the thing is, if you're within the concept of like... Western liberal democracy, you're going to say, of course, obviously. And in terms of like legal contract law, generally, yeah. But, and here's the thing, that's not really very relevant to what's being discussed, because Christianity has to be understood on its own terms. You can't understand something on some other terms. That doesn't mean anything. So, on Christianity's terms, the thing is, human beings are not as distinct, as disjointed, like atomized and separated with no relationship to each other, as in the sort of liberal secular ideal. If you've ever read John Donne's poem, For Whom the Bell Tolls, the one about, no man is an island entire unto himself, everyone's part of a whole, and so on, and so the death of anyone diminishes me. Therefore do not ask, I'm omitting a large portion of it, therefore do not ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. It's a great poem, read the whole thing. Anyway, that does point very well to the fact that human beings are not these atomized, unique, separate entities that have nothing to do with each other except being able to interact through physical space. Humanity as a whole is a family, and a family is something that's made up of more than one person. Just as a human being is a reality made up of more than one atom, as well as spirit, a family is made up of more than one person, but it is a real thing. It's not, it's not a direct analogy in the sense of like, it's not like a family has therefore a mind and a will and so on. But it is a real thing, and there is a real relationship in them. And so to fail to accept, within that, failing to accept restitution from another member of the human family is in fact it's illegitimate in that it is denying the familial relationship of all members of the human family. So, but we come into so the point I want to make about the crucifixion, where it becomes really obvious why the crucifixion, one reason why the crucifixion is necessary for the salvation of mankind, and God couldn't just go, whatever, is when you look at sin's effect on other people. So their sins affect on God, but God can essentially go and whatever on that. He has that authority, but he can't go and whatever on us. I mean, in the sense of and fulfill justice at the same time, because fulfilling justice is doing something else. So, because that's the thing, mercy is not supposed to be a contradiction of justice. Mercy is supposed to be a transcendence of justice, not only giving to a person what they deserve, but more. It's supposed to restore all balances and then some. It's not supposed to just throw the scale out. So you have the problem, then, of two people. Now, what if, if these two people will not make restitution for themselves? You then have the circumstance where, against one of God's creatures, some wrong has been done, there is an imbalance, and the person who did it is not restoring it. The crucifixion, therefore, comes in as a restoration of this balance, where the punishment is being taken on for this person such that incorporated through the family. And here we see, incidentally, the importance of the incarnation, Christ being both God and therefore infinite and capable of essentially, transcending time and space. The crucifixion is an infinite event in Christ's nature as God, but also a human event in Christ's nature as man. And therefore, as part of the human family, it is possible to do vicarious atonement on the part of people, because humanity does form a family. And so this is where Christ's, human and divine natures united in the one person becomes so necessary to the crucifixion, and to salvation, through this. So when you have, for example, so you have a person against whom wrong has been done, and the other person is not willing to offer satisfaction. Because, of course, if you have people who are at the end of time are saved, and accept God's offer of salvation, go to heaven, there is also they join themselves to the restitution of all wrong. So they in that in some manner beyond the present, do want to atone for their sins and therefore to restore balances. So that's well and good. That's not really difficult. But if they refuse this, if they refuse to accept this and refuse to make restitution for their sins, so one person murdered another and then will never refuses to repent of the murder that he committed, he owes something to the murder, to his victim for that, but in never repenting, he refuses to take part in any restitution. Therefore, Christ, as a member of the human family, has essentially gives on his behalf this atonement, this restitution, a life for a life, in this particular example. And so you have that atonement between the two creatures such that there is not a circumstance in which justice is not being fulfilled. Now, if God were simply to, say, whatever on the things that are owed to him, that would not be fulfilling justice between creatures. That would be leaving that completely unaddressed. I know I'm terrible with tangents, and I apologize. This is a video. You can pause and fast forward and rewind. But this is one reason why Martin Luther, for example, didn't believe in free will, because that basic, that Chickean version of, that's why many Protestants just don't do philosophy. Because the thing is, that version, which is the Chickean version, which also kind of basically is like Martin Luther's version, and it's more or less John Calvin's version of salvation as well. Martin Luther's snow-covered dunghills were still evil, just clothed in Christ. Calvin's, huddling in the shadow of the cross. We're saved, we're shielded from the wrath of the angry God. In either case are people improved. There is no restitution between creatures. There is no justice between creatures. So you either have to not think about it, or like Martin Luther, you get rid of free will. Actually, John Calvin mostly did too. It's not an accident, because if you get rid of free will, you don't have moral agents, and therefore you don't have injustice between them, and so you don't have this problem. So basically, they have a strong tendency to want to get rid of human beings, because human beings are hard to think about. In the full version, it actually works. If you have real human beings, this still works, precisely because of Christ being a member of the human family. So there's one other, so I'm sort of talking about the person who refuses salvation and, therefore refuses atonement for his sins and refuses to take part in atonement for his sins and so on. There is still, by virtue of, the human family is still making atonement on his behalf. There is the interesting question, though, of what if the person who is receiving it, because he has the ability to choose to accept it or choose not to. It's not legitimate. No, I mean, if he chooses to accept it, all well and good. If he chooses not to accept it, however, which he can do even though it's not legitimate to do, here we have hell. And this is just a really good way of looking at hell. Because, it's been said a number of times that the fires of hell is the burning love of God rejected. That the love of God is incredibly intense and incredibly real, and it is so apparent, it is impossible to ignore, impossible to turn away from. But it's not impossible to refuse to accept. It's not impossible to reject. So in that case of substitutionary atonement, where there is a person who will not atone for his sins, and he's not paying himself, another member of the human family, Christ, is paying on his behalf, the individual soul can still say, no, I will not accept that. It has to be him. It can't be you. Well, that's not going to happen within the hypothetical I've set up. And so for all eternity, he will be rejecting Christ's restitution of this human relationship. So you have, for all eternity, the human who is being offered a restitution of justice and a superseding of justice with mercy in that paying of everything. So the scales will be balanced and then everything is better as well. He won't accept it. He won't accept the only way this can actually happen. He wants a way in which it is impossible, given free will. And what you have here is somebody who has goodness on offer, but simply won't accept it. And the fact that this goodness is on offer, but he won't take it, you can see it if you can just put a little bit of imagination to the previous example where, the guy was stolen $10 and I take out $10 in my wallet and hand it to him and say, here, on the thief's behalf, I'm giving you your money back. Please forgive him. Nobody's going to say, oh, that's really kind. That's great. I'm not going to accept it, but, that really is good and would make everything better. No one's going to do that. The philosophy of it doesn't hinge on how a person would react, but just to help, paint the picture, no one is going to react like that. If a person is going to say, you can occasionally say, like, that's a wonderful, that's really sweet that you're offering. I just forgive him on my own. You don't need to give me the money. I forgive him. That can happen. That's like a realistic human thing. It's not common, mind you, but that is a realistic human reaction. The other realistic human reaction is going to be, no, that guy owes me the money. I am not accepting it from anyone but him. And that guy is going to pay if I have to beat it out of him. That's the other realistic human reaction. And in that, I think, in that reaction, you can see sort of a glimpse of hell. I will not accept goodness on any terms but my own. Things are going to be the way I want, or they're not going to happen. And that's how the love of God that restores all things could be painful. Because if the person doesn't stop offering the money, the other person's going to get angrier and angrier and angrier. But it's the nature of God to supply to give being, to supply the deficiency of all things in the manner that they, that is actually possible to supply it. And a person will just hate that more and more. And herein you see how love can be hellish to one who will not accept it. So that's kind of a little bit of a side note to the crucifixion, but nonetheless, it's part and parcel. It's sort of too interesting not to get into. Yeah, I digress a lot. I think everyone watching this channel knows that by now. Anyone who watches it regularly. If you're watching this for the first time, yeah, I digress a lot. But so to get back to the crucifixion and how this is not simply God setting up some bizarre rule and then having to trick himself into not following it. Any situation like that where God would simply wave things away would violate justice in the sense of balance. There would be injury that is not in any way restored. And that's not good. That's not real mercy. God, in his infinite being, is able to supply all deficiencies, but he supplied all deficiencies in a way such that all of nature is itself satisfied. So all the holes in nature created by sin do get filled up. It's not simple, because God takes into account the good of all things, but it does fulfill it. So that is how, that is why the crucifixion is directly, and that is a reason why the crucifixion is directly and necessarily related to salvation. If God simply waved his hands, justice would not be satisfied. Not so much between God and us, though. I mean, it's a complicated relationship, and I'm not trying to make specific claims on that. But in any event, it's not nearly as obvious why God couldn't wave away offenses against himself, but he can't, for much more obvious, much more intelligible reasons, simply wave away offenses against us. And anyone who's got children, one reason why God the Father is such an incredibly pervasive metaphor for God, is that as a parent, when one sibling attacks another, you can't just say, that's fine. It's fine that you hit your brother. That doesn't work. That's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. And everyone involved, if you just wave it away and say, no, I forgive you, the brother who was hit for no good reason gets incensed, and very legitimately, because that's not yours to give away. That's mine. I might have given it away, but you hurt me a second time by taking that away from me. That's the reaction you'll see. I mean, anyone who's had siblings will know this. I'm an only child myself, so I see this much more directly in my own children. But anyone who isn't an only child with no children will see this. And if you're in that circumstance like me before I had kids, make friends with somebody who's got siblings. It's very instructive. It's a big portion of human life you'd miss out on otherwise. It's a really good example of where you can't just do that. And all of life is a lot more complicated than the narrow little slice called a family, but still, those relationships, are there in the bigger too. So if it doesn't work even in the small version, it obviously isn't going to work in the big version. And so that's one reason. I have no doubt that there are as many reasons as there are relationships within creation, because God sees all things at once and deals all things with it at once and loves all things at once and works to the good of all things at once. We can't do that, so, we can only look at small slices. So, this is not comprehensive, but this is one reason. And hope that helps. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.